Hello and welcome to another GiantSlayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today we'll be taking a look at the current Top 5 compositions for patch 12.8. Let's address the elephant in the room. The current patch is almost identical to 12.7. That means whatever was working for you previously should still be working now. There are some changes like Scrap being nerfed a bit, which in turn makes Sivir slightly weaker, but those are nitpicky details. Consistency isn't a bad thing at all. In fact, it's quite good for anyone trying to climb because you don't need to learn a new meta. But it is nice when there's something new to talk about. Unfortunately, that is not this patch. With all that said, let's go ahead and get started with our totally new and never before seen top 5. But before we begin, please don't forget to click links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and journals with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our GiantSlayerTV social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 5, we have Arcanist coming in as the number 5 composition. The 5th best composition was actually difficult to pin down in the current meta because Arcanists are wildly inconsistent. Some games Ahri will pop off where a player will hit an early victor and coast to a top 4. Other games the Ahri will continually troll by missing every single orb. Then there's Arcanist variations like Twin Shot with Lucian carry, which is predicated on hitting specific augments and 3-starring Lucian in the mid game. Basically, there's a lot that can go wrong when playing Arcanist. But those issues aside, no other composition outside of the top 5 comes close to the strength of an Arcanist board. Sure, you may end up going a game in the bottom 4, but on average, players can consistently top 4 when playing an Arcanist board. There's also quite a few ways to play Arcanist, which we alluded to earlier. The stock standard way is Ahri carry with 4 to 6 Arcanists and Syndicate to back her up. Occasionally, you may see that Swap or Syndicate is the dominant synergy, but Arcanist is more commonly used. Ahri needs time to scale, meaning the hallmark of any good Ahri board is one with a solid frontline that buys a boatload of time for her to ramp up. Positioning is also key, which makes this composition quite unique. Yes, items are important, but a successful Ahri board is much more likely to do well with diligent scouting and positioning and an upgraded frontline, more so than specific items and augments. Unfortunately, at the end of the day, the best positioning in the world doesn't matter if Ahri decides to throw her orbs in the middle of nowhere. Besides Ahri, the other common variants for Arcanist is Victor. Victor is playable on a lot of different boards, so it's a bit much to say that all of those boards are Arcanists, since they really aren't. That said, Victor is easily playable with 4 to 6 Arcanists, Silco, and a frontline. The last variation that's played is Twin Shot with Lucian carry. This is done usually with an Arcanist emblem, but just having 4 to 6 Arcanists is alright as well. This is kind of a reroll board, but not really, because even though the win condition is Lucian 3, it's not playable without good items, augments, and an upgraded board. We don't recommend this variation unless you're high rolling everything like crazy. All in all, what makes Arcanist good in the meta is being able to stabilize well in the mid game with multiple variations to flex into. They also scale well into the late game, meaning an Arcanist board can win games just as often as it top 4s. Up next, we're getting a bit nebulous with our definition of a composition, as we have Innovator Flex coming in at number 4. Looking at the meta, we really wanted one of our top 5 compositions to reflect the idea of just flexing into whatever you hit. Most of the specific compositions, like Arcanist, are flexible, but they're rigid in a lot of ways as well. Arcanist uses primarily the Arcanist synergy, Renata Bruiser is mostly Chemtech Bruiser, and Sivir is all about Striker. Each of those boards can flex into a bunch of other units, but at their core, they can be defined by 1 to 2 specific synergies. Flex, on the other hand, just means playing what you hit. That can mean almost anything, which is why it's tough to lock down with a name. We could just call it Flex, but looking at the meta, Innovator is actually often the foundation that Flex boards are built from. Not so much because the Innovator trade is broken, but more so that it has a good early game, transitions easily into the mid game, and several of the champions are useful in a lot of different ways. For example, Echo has 3 tags, and that makes him an amazing splash unit for a lot of boards. Seraphine is a Socialite, and Socialite gets used often. Jace provides late game AD value, Zillion is Clockwork, and Singe ties in Chemtech. Basically, you can easily build off of 3 Innovators into a plethora of different boards. Let's get slightly more specific. Innovator Flex ends up being a way to play Snipers, Draven, or Jace. Sniper can be either Jhin or Zeri carry, with Zeri having the higher late game potential. The Jhin variation leans heavily into the Innovator tree, tosses in another Sniper for extra damage, and uses Orianna as backup AP damage. Zeri usually wants 3 Debonair, then whatever you can fit in. Innovator is an easy backdrop for Zeri because of Jhin and Zillion, plus the Socialite Hex is often quite good for her. All in all, Innovator Flex can be defined as taking an early game Innovator board and using it to transition into whatever you end up with in the mid game. Ezreal 2 with Singe and Echo is an amazing early game, and with good augments and a few items, it can definitely win streaky into stage 3. Even sticking with them in the mid game is fine if you're hitting the 4 cost units early enough. Basically, if you're looking to play any type of flex board, we recommend starting with Innovators as your core synergy and building from there, and we guarantee you'll be able to put together a decent board that can top 4. Moving on, we have Renata Bruiser coming in as the number 3 comp. Renata Bruiser is an easy-to-play composition with one of the best late games. There can be a bit of struggle to get into the mid-game comfortably because hitting level 8 is ideally what you want to do before rolling down to hit Renata 2, but given the pace in the meta is relatively slow, it's not too big of a deal. Overall, this board is what we recommend players learn in the current meta for how simple and effective it is. The simplicity of this composition stems from a solid mid-game board and how it almost holds the player's hand into the late game. All you need to play is Renata, 6 Bruisers, and a 3rd Chemtech in the mid-game. Once you hit Renata 2, you should be stable enough to look to level 9, and then all you need to do is put in Victor and Silgo, and boom, you're good to go. It's worth noting that Renata items are a bit rigid, as you for sure want blue buff from Morellonomicon to make her more effective. If you aren't able to secure those 2 items, then we suggest pivoting into a different board. Of course, it is playable without those items, but keep in mind the whole point of this board is to stabilize off of Renata 2, meaning you want items on her, and no other items are as effective as blue buff and Morellonomicon. On the plus side, the augments can be a whole lot of things since Renata doesn't rely on augments to do well. This means you can play heavy econ, aim for utility, or just boost your frontline in some way. Despite being a relatively specific composition, there is a fair amount of flexibility with the augments and items outside of Renata's. Keep in mind, as we said, this board lives and dies off of how quickly a player finds Renata 2. If you can make it to level 8, or even just high roll at level 7, then great! To the top you go. If not, we recommend pivoting into a composition that's less reliant on 2-starring one specific champion. But the plus side to committing to Renata is having the option to scale well into the late game, so always weigh the pros and cons based on your lobby before committing. Coming in at number 2, we have Mutant. Mutant is the most flexible yet rigid composition in the current meta. That may have sounded confusing, but let us explain. Because of how the Mutant synergy functions, every game is going to play out differently depending on what the mutation is. Then there's the mutant carries themselves, which are Kai'Sa, Kha'Zix, and Malzahar. Each has a specific mutation they do well with, and some can be played with multiple mutations. And then there's the mutant emblem, which opens up even more possible carries and champions that can be played. See what we mean now by mutant being flexible yet somewhat rigid, since it's locked within the confines of the mutation of the game. Not every mutant board is going to be 5 or more mutants, but in most of the games, there's going to be one of the 3 carries being utilized based on what the mutation is. Synaptic Web is where Malzahar shines, though he is overshadowed by the mutant emblem holders like Ahri and Victor. Kha'Zix does well with quite a few mutations such as Bioleeching, Cybernetic Enhancement, and Voidborn. Finally, Kai'Sa does best with Voracious, but really any of the mutations can be good for her. We should point out that yes, both Cybernetic and Voracious were nerfed in 12.8, but guess what? It didn't change anything. Mutant boards are still just as common as before and only slightly weaker. Same issues for Mutant are also still present, which is mostly how contested certain mutations are in a relatively weak late game outside of Voracious. So which is the best variant? Voracious is still king or queen because of Kai'Sa, but since it was nerfed slightly, it can be difficult to stabilize before hitting Kai'Sa 2. But once you do hit Kai'Sa 2, enjoy finishing in the top 2. Any version using Kha'Zix is going to do well in the mid game, but after the nerfs he received, his scaling is much weaker, so you really want to get strong in stage 4 and work towards a late game transition, otherwise it may be a struggle to even top 4. Malzahar is a fantastic item holder in stage 3 and 4 for AP boards, so you can always just use him and sell him later if you don't want to commit to a full mutant board. That said, Synaptic Web is still quite good, especially when you have a mutant emblem for Ahri or Victor, as this adds much needed scaling to the board. But overall, Synaptic is a bit weaker than it has been in the past, plus Malzahar is often contested by a lot of players, which makes 2-starring him difficult. Overall, Mutant is a fantastic board to play in the current meta if you're looking to play something slightly different each game. There's plenty of viable variations, and most mutations can be used effectively. And finally, we've arrived at our number 1 composition for 12.8, Sivir Striker. We have to be honest here, Sivir is not currently looking like the strongest composition in the meta. Oh, she's still strong, but the nerfs to scrap have actually been noticeable. Why then, you may ask, is Sivir Striker number 1? Because we're playing the long game. Everyone knows at this point that eventually Sivir ends up being the strongest composition in the meta. Even in 12.7, we didn't initially think she'd end up the best, and look where that led. Point is, we're done doubting the viability of Sivir. They also didn't technically nerf Sivir or Striker in the patch, just scrap, and while yes, that does hurt the Striker scrap composition, Sivir is still plenty strong. If you just hard force 4 Striker with good augments and items for Sivir every game, we're sure it's possible to climb the ladder easily. That all said, we'd love to be wrong about this, but history has shown that even if Sivir seems weak at the beginning of a patch, by the end of it, she's likely the strongest carry in composition. Exactly how to play Sivir may also change, but for now we recommend sticking to Scrap Striker since it still works well, or only playing Sivir when you have a Striker emblem and can force 6 Strikers. Hextech may also make a comeback, but we're not convinced on that front just yet. Our recommendation is to keep trying Sivir Striker when it makes the most sense and avoid hard forcing it too often. As the meta settles, we may eventually see the return of 5 Sivir players per game, but for now, if your goal is to climb, you can be a bit pickier about when you play this comp. That's all for today, folks. We wish there was more to talk about in the meta, but honestly, outside of the top 5 comps we listed, most of the compositions are just flex and playing around 5-cost champions. Rerolling seems to be rare, with Warwick, Talon, and Twitch still floating around the outskirts of the meta and occasionally doing well. Let us know in the comments section below what your current favorite composition is. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.